Imagine a city wiped off the face of the earth in a single day, and the people who did not retreat, even when it seemed they had no chance left. Why did German generals call Stalingrad the death kettle? And why did the attempt to save the Wehrmacht's most powerful army remain only on paper? In this episode, we will reveal the non-obvious details of the legendary battle where the fate of the war and the entire world was decided. Onward to the main mysteries of the Eastern Front. The name Stalingrad is forever written in history in letters of blood. It is not just a point on the map, not just a city on the great Russian River Volga. It is a symbol that embodies incredible courage, superhuman resilience, and that very turning point in the most terrible war of the 20th century. For millions of people, both then and now, it was here, among the flaming ruins, that the fate of not only the Soviet Union but all of Europe was decided. As frontline soldiers said, here, the fate of Europe was decided. Every stone, every meter of the Volga bank became an arena of struggle, the outcome of which determined the further course of the Second World War. However, an aura of myths and mysteries surrounded the Battle of Stalingrad from the very beginning. One of the most persistent is the assertion that the city had exclusively political propaganda significance, that its fierce defense was waged only because of Stalin's name. Indeed, the symbolic weight of the city bearing the leader's name was enormous. Its loss would have dealt a crushing blow to the morale of the country and the army. But if it were only about the name, the military machine, however cruel it was, would hardly have thrown so many forces and resources onto the altar of this goal. The reality was much more pragmatic and strategically significant. The opinion of military leaders on both sides of the front converged on one thing. Stalingrad was a key hub whose importance was determined by geography and logistics. This largest industrial and transport center was the most important gateway to the Caucasus, to the oil fields that were the lifeblood of the war for the Wehrmacht's tanks and aircraft. By controlling the Volga near Stalingrad, the Soviet command ensured critically important supplies of fuel, food, and weapons from the southern regions of the country. For the advancing enemy, the capture of the city would mean cutting this vital artery, depriving the Red Army of strategic resources, and opening the way deep into the country. Thus, Stalingrad became a trap that both sides fell into. But only one was destined to emerge victorious. The German command, blinded by initial successes and prestige considerations, did not immediately realize that it was being drawn into a war of attrition in urban ruins, where its superiority in maneuver and aviation lost its power. The Soviet leadership, understanding the strategic value of the city, was ready to stand to the death. Stalingrad was not just a city to be held. It became giant pincers in which the backbone of the most powerful military machine of that time was to be broken. And this turning point began not with the thunderous volleys of Katyushas, but with the quiet, tragic, and heroic approach of a catastrophe that forever changed the course of history. The summer of 1942 was a time of the most severe trials and dark forebodings. After the failure near Moscow, the Wehrmacht, having regrouped, launched a new large-scale offensive in the southern direction. Its spearheads rapidly rushed towards the Volga, and by August the threat loomed over Stalingrad. The catastrophe was approaching inexorably, and its first act was a firestorm that hit the city. A key starting point was August 23rd. On this day, German aviation carried out one of the most monstrous in density and destructiveness bombings of the entire war. Hundreds of planes, wave after wave, wiped out residential areas, factories, and parks from the face of the earth. According to eyewitnesses, it was impossible to breathe. Even stones were burning, and metal melted from the unbearable heat. It seemed that the air itself was saturated with fire and death. The city disappeared in fire, was how those who miraculously survived this hell described that day. Turned into ruins, Stalingrad from a viable organism became a landscape for close combat, a field for the future, rat war. On the approaches to the burning city, the defense was held not only by regular units of the Red Army, which retreated with heavy fighting, trying to cling to every line. A little-known but heroic page is inscribed in the history of those days. Workers' battalions fought side by side with the soldiers. Formed from employees of Stalingrad factories, often without proper military training and equipment, they went to meet the enemy to buy time for organizing the defense at the cost of their own lives. Their selflessness became one of the first manifestations of that Stalingrad spirit that would later amaze the whole world. The chaos of the first days is also associated with one of the curious but telling rumors generated by the confusion at the front. Among the German units, a story persistently circulated about a lost Soviet division that the Germans were looking for near Stalingrad but never found. This legend, probably born from the chaotic movements of Soviet units and the actions of individual detachments in the rear of the advancing enemy, eloquently testifies to the prevailing confusion and that even in the conditions of a catastrophic retreat, the Red Army remained a mystery to the enemy, capable of presenting an unpleasant surprise. Thus, in Smoke and Fire, one of the most tragic and decisive battles in human history began to unfold. With the fall of the city in the classical sense of the word, the fighting did not stop. It transformed into something new, unseen, and extremely cruel. Maneuver operations in open terrain were replaced by total war in the ruins, which received the apt and eerie name from German soldiers: Rattenkrieg, Rat War. There was no familiar front line. It ran through basements, attics, breaches in walls, and even stairwells inside a single surviving building. The outcome of the battle for a city block, or even for a separate building, was decided not by artillery preparation, but by a sudden hand-to-hand fight in the semi-darkness of ruins, where the main weapons became the bayonet, entrenching shovel, and soldier's cunning. In these conditions, a special tactic of Stalingrad close combat was born, built on improvisation and desperate ingenuity. Soviet soldiers, perfectly adapted to the chaos of ruins, became real masters of night raids and sudden attacks. Among the defenders of the city, there were anecdotes about how small groups of fighters, using thick fog mixed with smoke and dust, or the night darkness covering the city, silently moved through piles of bricks and gaps into basements occupied by the enemy to shoot the stunned enemy at point-blank range. These stories, overgrown with legends, colorfully illustrate how psychologically exhausting such a war was. German soldiers, accustomed to clear operational control and superiority in technology, were morally unprepared for this nightmare. Strange, irrational rumors spread among them about ghosts of Stalingrad, elusive and invisible defenders who appeared and disappeared without a trace among the ruins, sowing panic. The overwhelming superiority of Soviet infantry in this specific type of combat generated a feeling of vulnerability and doom among the invaders. One frontline soldier accurately noted the essence of these battles. The main weapon was not the rifle, but the shovel and entrenching tool. It was they in the hand-to-hand fight, in cramped basements and corridors, that decided the outcome of the deadly clash, becoming a symbol of the cruel reality of the Stalingrad meat grinder. In the Stalingrad ruins, where the offensive of large formations lost its meaning, the art of accurate shooting elevated snipers to the rank of the main characters. Their work was not just an element of battle, it became a separate dimension of war, where psychological pressure on the enemy sometimes meant more than the number of soldiers killed. German infantrymen were afraid to raise their heads, knowing that any movement in the field of view of Soviet marksmen could be their last. This sniper blockade paralyzed enemy activity during the day, forcing them to live in constant tension. The figure of Vasily Zaitsev, a Pacific Fleet sailor, became a symbol of this confrontation. His personal count numbered hundreds of killed soldiers and officers, but the real legend, shrouded in rumors and artistic interpretations, was his duel with the head of the German sniper school, Major Koenig, or Erwin Koning, according to various sources. According to this story, an ace, specially sent to Stalingrad, was supposed to suppress the Soviet snipers and raise the morale of the German units. Several days of tense hunting, when life hung by a thread and the opponents studied the slightest details of the terrain, ended with Zaitsev's victory. This episode, which became central in the narrative about Stalingrad snipers, perfectly illustrates the intellectual duel among the ruins, where patience, a keen eye, and composure meant much more than brute force. But success was not based solely on personal skill. The snipers of Stalingrad elevated military cunning to the level of high art. The most unexpected techniques were used for camouflage and disorienting the enemy. Among the fighters, there were stories about special decoy dolls, dummies of a head or helmet, which were set up to identify enemy snipers. Mirrors fixed on bayonets or sticks were used to inspect a corner or entrance under cover without risking exposure. To combat experienced enemy snipers, tricks like shot sticks, imitating a rifle barrel or shooting in anticipation, when the next likely point of the opponent's appearance was calculated, were used. False moves and pre-prepared spare positions allowed them to disappear without a trace after a few shots, confusing and demoralizing the enemy, making him believe that he was being pursued by an invisible and omnipresent opponent. This inventiveness in conditions of total scarcity became as powerful a weapon as a precise rifle, turning every duel into a complex chess game with death. 2 months of exhausting street fighting created a dangerous illusion in the German command that victory was a matter of time and perseverance. They were so concentrated on storming the city that they overlooked the strategic trap being prepared by the Soviet command. Operation Uranus, which began on November 19, 1942, was a stunning counterblow that changed the entire picture of the war on the Eastern Front. On that day, the volleys of thousands of guns fell, not on the positions in the city, but on the flanks of the stretched German wedge, which were held by less combat-ready Romanian and Italian units. Powerful tank formations of the Red Army, secretly concentrated in the steppes, broke through the front and rushed towards each other, not giving the enemy time to recover. Just 4 days later, on November 23rd, in the area of the city of Kalakhandan, the giant pincers of the Soviet fronts closed. In the operational encirclement, in the Stalingrad cauldron, was the selected elite grouping of the Wehrmacht, the 6th Field Army under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, as well as part of the forces of the 4th Tank Army. This was one of the most crushing successes of the Red Army in the entire war. The lightning breakthrough and rapid encirclement, carried out in a matter of days, gave rise to a mythologized rumor among the Soviet soldiers exhausted by the long defense about a flying division on the Volga, some unseen, swift, and unstoppable force that allegedly brought the long-awaited victory. This legend, devoid of specifics but full of hope, was a vivid product of popular rumor, seeking an explanation for such a large-scale and finally successful maneuver. For the encircled German soldiers and officers, a period of shock and gradual awareness of the imminent catastrophe began. The attempt by Army Group Dawn under the command of Manstein to de-blockade Paulus's army in December 1942, Operation Winterstorm, failed, falling short of the cauldron by only a few dozen kilometers. Hopes for supply by air, promised personally by Hitler, turned out to be ghostly. The Luftwaffe could not provide even the minimum necessary. Among the German units freezing in the steppe winds, without adequate supplies of food and ammunition, despair and confusion reigned. Anecdotal but indicative stories have been preserved about German officers who, in a state of shock, shouted, "The Volga is the end!" This phrase became a bitter insight, a symbol of the collapse of all strategic plans and personal hopes, the culmination of which was the final capitulation of the remnants of the Sixth Army in early February 1943. The mighty military machine, which had recently been rushing to the Volga, was not just stopped, but utterly defeated, marking the beginning of a radical turning point in the war. The Battle of Stalingrad, which became an inhuman clash of two armies, gave rise not only to heroic chronicles, but also to the richest soil for rumors, myths, and legends that were born in the trenches and dugouts on both sides of the front. These stories, circulating among soldiers, were a special reflection of the psychological state of people forced to exist for months on the verge of life and death, where the line between reality and fiction was often erased. On the Soviet side, there were tales of the supernatural, almost mystical resilience of the simple Russian soldier. Fighters capable of surviving in icy ruins without normal supplies and not closing their eyes for weeks. In the eyes of their comrades and the enemy, themselves became part of the legend. German soldiers, exhausted by street fighting, were inclined to see in the defenders of the city not people but some invulnerable ghosts. These moods gave rise to a rumor about the enchanted ruins of the city, where every stone seemed hostile to the invader and helped the defenders. A paradoxical product of the cruel reality of war were also stories of betrayal, intertwined with ideological clichés. On both sides, persistent but unreliable rumors circulated about a division of Russians who allegedly fought on the side of Germany right in the Stalingrad cauldron. Such myths reflected the prevailing confusion and attempts to explain to oneself the ferocity of resistance and the difficulty of identifying the enemy in urban combat. The defeat of the Nazi troops at Stalingrad was not just one of many victories. It was a fundamental turning point in the entire course of the Second World War. Its results and consequences had not only military, strategic, but also colossal psychological significance, changing the balance of power and sentiments on both sides of the front. First of all, Stalingrad dealt a crushing blow to the myth of the invincibility of the Wehrmacht. The most powerful 6th Field Army, considered the elite of the German ground forces, was not just stopped, but destroyed or captured. The scale of the catastrophe was unprecedented for Germany. The figures announced by the Soviet command spoke for themselves. In the Stalingrad cauldron, hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers and officers were destroyed or taken prisoner. A huge amount of equipment and weapons, tanks, guns, aircraft, was captured. This defeat forced the countries of the Hitlerite coalition to realize that the war, which had previously seemed almost won, had turned into a protracted and merciless battle of attrition, where the initiative began to sleep from Germany's hands. The psychological shock experienced in Berlin and in the German army was eloquently reflected in the words of one of the German generals, whose quote from a diary became a verdict on the former confidence. "After Stalingrad, we were never the same again." In these words, an admission of not only military, but also moral defeat. For the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the word Stalingrad became synonymous with death, encirclement, and hopelessness, undermining their morale. For the Soviet Union and its allies, the victory on the Volga became the most powerful moral stimulus. It proved that the Red Army had not only learned to fight, but was capable of planning and conducting the most complex strategic operations, encircling and destroying entire enemy groupings. This success strengthened the belief in victory both at the front and in the rear. The strategic initiative finally passed to the USSR, which predetermined the further course of the war, and laid the foundation for all subsequent offensive operations, right up to Berlin itself. Stalingrad became the point after which the German troops could no longer recover and launch a new large-scale offensive on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad forever remained in history, not just as a city, but as a symbol of incredible courage and mysteries solved at the cost of incredible efforts. That's all. Write in the comments which story from the city's defense impressed you the most. Subscribe so you don't miss new historical mysteries. Until next time.